The goal is to understand black organizing in the North by free slaves. By the end, you need to have an understanding of these terms, and you want to be able to analyze the primary source documents that are in the framework. First thing we're going to be looking at is the total free versus the total population, which is here. In the next couple slides, we're going to use data and graphs, and your goal is to analyze and interpret, come up with a conclusion about the various data points. But for the most part, we're going to be looking at this total free and how that total free group started to establish black schools, businesses, and church to try to change the situation in America, try to develop some sort of African American culture. Again, what we want to do is analyze some of these data points as we look at, for example, this state, South Carolina. We see that they have a black population that is greater than the white population. So why would that matter? Again, we want to analyze the graphs. We're comparing the black population, the free population. Now, when you look at some of those data points, you're probably wondering why they vary, and that's partially a result of sectionalism. Sectionalism, the various different segments of the United States and how their economies and their population just differs. For example, when we look at the slave population in the Deep South, you're definitely going to see a different form of an economy simply because it's dependent on cotton. We're going to see more individuals in those particular areas, which can be further viewed in this particular graph where we see the bulk of cotton trade. Here we see corn, which is very different from the industrial North. Keep in mind this would also further the division between the North and South. And we start looking at some of the data points from the census, which is what we're looking at here. We have the states, we have the years. And what you want to do for these data points is to pretty much just come up with some conclusions, analyze the various states, comparing their free population to their slave population. And as we see some of those individuals who are able to achieve their freedom, they're going to start to rally and try to engage in some sort of political solution to the circumstances that they are experiencing. For example, we can look at Henry Highland Garnet, who was advocating for armed resistance, which could be some form of motivation by Nat Turner. Keep in mind that this particular revolution led to some 60 white people being slain. Denmark Vesey, another individual, was trying to initiate some form of revolution, some sort of plot, but it was foiled. And then, of course, we hear from Maria Stewart, who wrote a manifesto. All of these individuals have a different approach within the Black Civil Rights Movement. Some are a little more nationalistic in their approaches, whereas others are a little more, I don't want to use passive to diminish, but just not as extreme. In the textbook, you can read about some of the institutions that are emerging. And for the most part, these institutions are emerging because of some of the segregation practices or some of the treatment in some of these particular institutions. Here we can see the Free African Society, which is going to play a leadership role, established in 1787. Here we see some burial issues. We're trying to look at some of these institutions. Again, they all go back to what it was like for African Americans or the freed slaves at this particular point. where even just burial seems to be an issue. And you're starting to establish black cemeteries, black churches. And keep in mind, once again, it's a result of the segregated policies that prompts the development of an institution like this. As far as education is concerned, education is going to be viewed as a way to move up. Then we start looking at the transition to the African American female experience, which is definitely different from the male experience, and that's what is being addressed here, to try to look at the experience and the term intersectionality that's going to start to be used, which is looking at the overlap of different minority experiences. So, for example, women, slave women are dealing with an experience that is definitely different from what the male experience is like. Now, in the 1800s, keep in mind that the women's civil rights movement is starting to emerge, where 1848 at Seneca Falls, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and this was the Seneca Falls. This was a result of Elizabeth Cady Stanton trying to speak at a slave convention and was told that she should not bring up the issue of gender with regard to in the speech, because this was an issue that was supposed to address the ending of slavery. So they didn't want to overlap the issues of gender and race. So the argument is that, the women's civil rights activists went back home, met at Seneca Falls, and created their Declaration of Sentiments. This timeline pretty much tracks that. Here's that slave convention. The women were told they were not allowed to speak on behalf of women. So then they went to Seneca Falls to establish the women's rights movement. And then you get into the Civil War, which complicates the situation for the women's rights movement, because the freed slave would wind up getting the right to vote, which would leave women behind, which would then prompt these groups to emerge to create this group, the NAWSA, which would eventually get women the right to vote through the 19th Amendment. So this is just tracking again, trying to establish that the women's rights movement is pretty much going on at the same time that the fight to end slavery is going on. So I'm going to just put 2 marks representing both of those 2 movements. And this is a more recent article from about 2023, and it's looking at the women's rights movement as well as the abolitionist movement, and it's addressing the issue of women and their anger as a result of African slaves getting the right to vote ahead of white women. And that's what's being outlined here. They reference Frederick Douglass, and here they reference that women's rights movement. Intersectionality is in the AP framework. This is where you start to see some of these models. Intersectionality, again, is about that overlap. You might see another social model. Don't know how I feel about this one, because this one assumes that the people above the line are bad, whereas the people below the line are good. And that is definitely an issue that is going to raise some concern among conservatives, who are being told that because they're any of these, that they're automatically bad people. Just keep in mind, when you're using these social models, definitely want to use them carefully, because they can be perceived as offensive by some. You do have to analyze this source here by Maria Stewart. In this particular section right here, it's pretty much looking at the condition. If you stay here, you're going to die. If you go to a foreign land, that could also be problematic there. You will die. So it's looking at all of the potential options within the fight to end slavery, like what actually are you going to do? If you're going to leave, as some people wanted to, that could bring its own problems. If you do nothing, then the end result will be, pretty much the same. Slavery is not going to be abolished. So the real debate here is, how do you proceed forward? Here we're looking at the institution of slavery, a couple of examples. As we continue with this source, and I'm not going to analyze every particular aspect of this, but for example, in this section right here, we're looking at the labor, and the argument is that few white persons are willing to do some of that labor, that the slave is in a position where they have to do this particular labor, continual drudgery and toil. Neither do I know any who have enriched themselves by spending their lives as house domestic, washing windows. So here it's looking at the low skill of the labor, and how actually would somebody actually be able in American society to become wealthy, with that particular type of labor. Continuing with the labor theme, the whites have so long and so loudly proclaimed the theme of equal rights and privileges. Those ideals in the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, they apply to one group, but do not apply to the other group. And it looks like Maria Stewart is calling them out on that. Now we get back to the labor issue. In this section, we start to see a transition to a gender expectation or argument. It is upon you that women depends, and then she transitions to looking at that dependence on man. However, how can the slave woman depend on the male, considering the fact that the male is in servitude? In this section, we see a connection to the Pilgrims. Our oppression is soon to come to an end. Then the transition here is, did the Pilgrims, when they first landed on these shores, quietly compose themselves and say, the Britons have all the money and all the power, and we must continue their servants forever? And we know where that ended up. That eventually leads to the American Revolution. And so what you can take from this is a argument or a comparison where the author is suggesting that at some point there is definitely going to be some response to slavery, and it's possibly not going to be permanent. And as we get to the end, you want to check your notes, make sure you have an understanding of the definitions, that you understand the sources that were presented for today's class. And if you want to check your notes for your definitions, here are the definition answers.